Cool. I think I'll give a quick overview about the talk and about myself. So, I have been working with small case for about 2.5 years now, and even before that, I've been working with accessibility for about 5 years. I am particularly interested in web accessibility, but like now I've started looking into mobile accessibility as well. Uh, I am a lead software engineer, and I uh, like mostly have expertise with front end. Right now, at this point in time, I'm interested in accessibility and system design and design systems in general, multi-tenancy on front end. So yeah, I mean mostly that is it about me and an introduction about this talk in particular. So this is going to be about a particular problem with accessibility, where we tend to create designs or tend to create components which have nested interactions, and that is not good for assistive technologies like screen reader or sometimes even the keyboard and mouse users as well. So we'll discuss those problems, and then we'll discuss some of the patterns that can help solve those problems. This talk is not particularly about React, but the patterns that we talk about, they can obviously be implemented in React. Most of these things are in context of a component uh, based design, or like what something like what React provides, or Vue, or even Angular. So like when you think of uh, development in terms of component, you will face these kind of problems, and that is where I think uh, I'll try to solve some of the problems that we'll get into by default. Cool. Quickly getting started with the talk. The first thing is, what do we mean by nested interactive elements? So like you already know what are interactive elements, things like button or link or anything which allows user interaction, check boxes, different input types and everything, right? So all of these elements are interactive elements, and this talk or this particular problem is related to when we nest interactive elements, which means that whenever we have a link inside a link in markup, or whenever we have a button inside a link, or when we have a checkbox inside a button, or when we have a link inside a checkbox. So we'll see why that is incorrect, why that is invalid HTML, why that is an incorrect accessibility pattern, and we'll see what problems it poses and what kind of solutions we can have. None of those solutions are actually trivial. So like, which is why if you have any particular questions during the talk, you can ask me, and we'll see if we can answer them right there or towards the end of the talk. Cool. So about nested interactions or nested interactive elements, there are obviously some HTML spec, or there are ARIA specs which mention why you should not have nested interactive elements. I've just added some detail about it here. Nothing that we need to particularly go into, but in general, it is invalid HTML if you have nested interactive elements. If you run it through an HTML validator, it will give you an error that you have a button inside a button, or you have an anchor inside a button. To like work around this, some people tend to just create divs with an on click, which again like is an accessibility problem, because then the div only has an on click and it does not have the keyboard accessibility or the screen reader accessibility that you might require, which again violates something called WCAG 4.1.2, the rule which says that interactive elements for mouse users should also be accessible to screen reader users if they are supposed to provide the same functionality to screen reader. Similarly, there is a spec for ARIA and HTML which exactly specifies what roles can be nested, which elements can be nested, and in what way. So, like worth going through if you are actually getting into some problem related to nested interactive elements. Then any kind of accessibility tooling, if you use anything for manual testing or for automated testing, it will also again tell you that this is a problem. So I've just listed down two or three popular tools and how they report these errors and what kind of suggestions they make. Cool, we'll jump into examples very quickly. So if you have been writing HTML for a while, and if you get into a situation where you are writing an anchor inside an anchor, then by default, like reflexively, you will say that it feels wrong for some reason, because like this is not something that you do typically. There might be some use case for which you are doing it now, but by default you'll think that okay, this is not all right, right, even without a validator telling you. But in some cases it's actually difficult for you to say by intuition whether something is right or wrong. So for example, button inside button might feel incorrect for some people who have like a habit of working with HTML validators or who already have some context about accessibility. But then for newer developers, it might not mean anything. Like they might be nesting button inside button, especially with component based frameworks where you do not know what the parent component markup looks like, right? So then the third one is definitely problematic and very specific, even for people who have been working with markup for a while. Once you use like role equal to button inside another role equal to button, this wouldn't by default feel incorrect to you because you know that okay, anchor inside anchor looks incorrect because you've been working with anchor element for a long time. Button inside button might look incorrect because you've been working with button elements for a long time. But as you do div role equal to button and there is another div role equal to button inside it, like by default you wouldn't feel that it is something which is wrong, and especially because it does not lead to any visual problems. And the HTML validator would not complain as well in most cases because like uh, the new validators might complain because they also understand the ARIA roles and everything, but generally HTML validators would not complain about it because HTML validators would only complain about HTML elements and their default semantics. But all of the above are actually incorrect. We'll see some examples of why, and like why would it be confusing if we create something like this. So like in terms of problems that we get into with nested interactive elements, there are problems which are for like applicable to mouse users, and there are problems which are applicable to keyboard users, screen reader users, and even other assistive technologies that we do not use on a day-to-day basis. Then there's a problem of user expectations. Like even if you create an element which has some kind of nested interaction, since the user has not seen any such elements in the wild and even in like any known applications that they use, they wouldn't really understand by default how to use a certain interaction, right? Then browser behaviors differ based on what kind of nesting you are doing. So we'll just quickly see some problems that might happen with this, right? But we'll not go in depth into every problem because there are some examples which through which we'll try to understand these problems later, right? So like just giving you a quick example of where it could be a problem for mouse users, right? So let's say you have a checkbox, right? And the checkbox label has a link in it, right? If you have seen something like a terms and conditions terms and conditions model where there is a checkbox saying I have read the terms and conditions, and the like terms and conditions itself is a link, right? So now if you know checkbox behavior, you would know that clicking on the label would actually select the checkbox. But in this case, the label has a link. So when you click on the link, should it actually take you to the link or should it check the checkbox? Now, as a visual user, you probably have an intuition that actually it should just open the link and it should not check the checkbox. But clicking the rest of the label would probably check the checkbox, right? So as a visual user, you wouldn't really mind that, okay, this is a behavior that the developer has built in. Although semantically, this is incorrect because the semantic behavior of checkbox is to uh, toggle the checkbox when the label is clicked, and in this case the label contains a link, and if link is clicked, then like what is the supposed behavior? Like should link open and checkbox should not get checked? Should link not open, only checkbox should get checked? Or should link open as well as checkbox should get checked, right? Our intuition says that okay, link should open, checkbox should not get checked because that is how visually we are used to interacting with elements. But someone who is using a keyboard, someone who is using a screen reader, since the semantic shown to them is more like this is a checkbox label, like they would actually not be shown that there is a link or something, or otherwise they will just be shown that there is a link but there is no checkbox because screen readers cannot uh, decipher this kind of nested interactive patterns because that is not what they are built for, and that is something that is by default inappropriate to use in a assistive technology environment, right? So this is a problem which mouse users would definitely face. Going to keyboard users, let's say you have some nested interactive element, right? So in that case you have a div which, or like let's say you have a button which is clickable as a whole, then there is a lot of content inside the button and there is another button or link inside it, right? So now what should be the tab order? If you tab, then it should first tap to the parent button then tap to the child, or like it should actually ignore the child and just move to the sibling element, because generally this is how tab works, that it tabs through siblings, right? It goes from one element to the next. It it generally does not go inside an element for the next step, because that is not what the default keyboard behavior states, right? In some cases, browsers would try to make sure that there are like sensible defaults, which means that they would actually go inside the nested element, and then they would try to make sure that all the focusable elements inside the nested elements also get focused. But then this is a browser implementation, right? It might depend that some browser does not implement it in this way because this is not in spec, right? This is something which is not allowed by spec, so there is no reason for them to implement it in a standardized way, although like mostly they have sensible default, so not a major problem. But then in this case, another problem that happens is, where do you put the like visual focus indication, right? Where do you put the focus indicator? Once you are on the outside element, you can put it on the outside element, but as you tap forward, should the focus still remain on the outside element or come to inside element? Again, a problem with how browsers support this in different ways, because there is no standard for this. Then, like screen readers, I think I've already mentioned some of the issues. So for screen readers, it is particularly problematic because, let's say, you have a link inside a link. Now, screen reader user focuses on the outside link. What should the like label read for them? Should it actually consider the label of the internal link as well, or should it not? Like, how do you define what should be announced to the screen reader in this case, right? When they focus on the outside link, should it announce the text of the inside link as well, or should it not? Like, we'll see examples, and you will get to understand why this is majorly problematic. Like, this is something that uh, can just not be solved using any of our easier patterns, where we can say that okay, it is a minor problem for the user, so we'll let go of it. But this is not a minor problem, because screen readers, they either will definitely ignore the internal element and would not announce whatever is in the internal element. Screen reader focus by default would not go to the internal element. So like, it would be very difficult for a screen reader user, or for that matter any other assistive tech user, to actually know that there is a nested interactive element, and if there is, then what is the label of the internal element, what is the label of the external element, right? So this, just hearing this, it does not look like a major problem that cannot be solved, right? It actually can be solved, but then since it is not a trivial pattern, there are very complex patterns which you can have with nested interaction. So it is like, it does not make sense for screen readers and even HTML spec to solve it right now, right? So we'll just quickly see some of these examples where we have nested interactions, and then we'll quickly see some of the solutions that we may have for them, and like why do these problems happen. Also, I'll just go to the next slide. We have already talked about these failing examples, so we'll not go through this once again. But let's just quickly get an understanding of why do we end up with nested interactive elements, right? So there are two parties involved in it. One is someone who designs the component; they have to make sure that the interaction patterns are appropriate, and then someone who actually creates the component in code, like implements the component, they have to make sure that the like interaction patterns are appropriate. So as devs, why do we like exactly need nested interactive elements, or like why do we end up with nested interactive elements? The major reason is like, we have a component based framework, and since we cannot see the markup of the parent component, we don't really know whether the button that we are creating can end up in inside another button, or whether the parent element component has any other interactive elements inside which my component would be rendered, right? Because we are not used to seeing the final generated HTML in these cases. Whenever we are using a component based framework like React or Vue, we only look at the JSX that we have in code. What rare, or like let's say we'll look at the React componentry in React debugger, but rarely would we see the generated HTML to figure out what the exact markup that is generated looks like. And if we don't do that, I mean, we wouldn't generally do that, then we'll not be able to know in most cases that there is a nested interaction that has happened, right? Because I mean, uh, during coding there is no easy way for to you to actually just like, every time you cannot go to all the parent elements and figure out where uh, your child is being rendered in, and how to like how to see whether there is a interactive element in parent also, and especially if the parent is coming from a third party library, obviously you'll not make that effort just because uh, like it requires a lot of time to do that. The second thing is, why do we end up creating these interactive elements in a nested way, is because we misinterpret designs. So if the designs are not clearly communicated, we might think of things as being positioned inside each other, but instead of like uh, understanding that the designer wanted to say that these buttons or these elements are supposed to be siblings, we might end up creating them on inside the other, right? So that is another problem. And the next problem with devs is, like, when we are using a third party library, obviously we cannot like, even if we know that there is a problem, we cannot change anything because we are not going to change the third party library. So when that happens, we'll just like probably let it go, that okay, if this has to work like this, then it has to work like this. So these are mostly the problems on the dev side that lead to nested interactive elements. There is no like particular need on the dev side for nested interactive elements. It's not like on dev we cannot get rid of this problem, but due to these two or three reasons, they generally end up with these nested elements. Then the other problem is on the design side, right? So if designers are not creating a design in a way that they can define interactions which are not nested, then as devs we would probably need to create those components in a nested way, right? So the problem with design is that the nested way of thinking is very common nowadays. Like, it is not like something which can be simplified. So like once we see some examples, you'll be able to relate to it better. But in general, like, designers would not want to be limited by this limitation from spec that you cannot have nested interactive elements. They would want you to create them in a way that they are spec compliant, they are accessible, but they are still like visually they look nested because that is how the UI demands it. Like, this is arguable. Obviously they can create some simpler interactions, but then uh, like, they should also not be limited by this fact that the technology that they are using uh, limits the designs in a certain way, right? The designers, they should not think about designs in a way that it is going to be written in HTML, so it has to behave a certain way, or it has to be, if it is going to be written in a React Native or something, then it has to behave a certain way. They will create, they can, or they should be able to create designs which are independent of the technology that we are using, right? So that is one reason why designers, they sometimes need nested interactions, but also like they end up with nested interactions because they don't really uh, they aren't really bound to the technology that is going to create those components. Cool. We'll just quickly go through some examples where people have done it right. Right. So two of the products that I use on a regular basis, one is Twitter, one is Gmail. Both of them have a lot of nested interactions, at least UI wise. Like, visually, if you see, you will see that okay, these elements are nested within each other. The markup can certainly be like in a different way, but they do it right. So like some of the examples from Twitter, if you see, the whole tweet is keyboard accessible, and then if you tab, it goes to the next interactive element, which is the name of the person. If you tab next, it goes to the next interactive element, which is the hashtag. If you tab, then it goes to the three dot menu. If you then tab, then it goes to the comment, then retweet, then like, and then share. So they have created it in a way which works fine for the keyboard user, and if you test it using a screen reader, it actually works fine for the screen reader user as well, right? So they have some good examples. On the right, if you can see, like, there is another on, even in your notifications, the whole notification is clickable, but then if there is any other link inside the notification, that also is interactive. Similarly, uh, the uh, there is a panel from Gmail, the third screenshot, which is code. So this, again, the whole label is clickable, but then if you hover over the label, there is a three dot menu that appears, and this three dot menu is actually accessible by keyboard as well as screen readers as well, right? Although in the UI it is nested, right? So they definitely have some good patterns for this, which may or may not be spec compliant, because like everyone solves these problems in a different way, but at least it is not interactive in a nested way. Same for other examples from Twitter, right? So the one that you see, politics trending, in here, the whole card is tabbable, then the three dot menu is tabbable, then the hashtag is tabbable. So like all of these things are created in a very good way. Now coming to like how do we solve these issues. So as we saw that there are two major reasons of this happening. One is because of a dev mistake or oversight, like they did not uh, appropriately consider the designs and they ended up creating nested elements instead of sibling elements, or like where they are using component based framework. How can we fix these problems? So one is if if you work with accessibility, probably you already have some kind of a HTML validator uh, built into one of your tooling. Like I have a HTML validator which is bookmarked. I mean, I don't think you can see that because it is in the browser toolbar. But I have a HTML validator which is bookmarked because like I generally work a lot with accessibility, so I tend to check on my HTML time and again. But then again, it is not a regular workflow for any dev. So generally, whenever there is a semantic HTML error, it also appears on the browser console. So whenever you are looking for JavaScript errors, if there is a semantic HTML error, it actually also appears. So you might have seen a lot of cases where you are using, let's say, a div inside a paragraph or something that like which is not allowed for some reason, then you will get these warnings on the browser console, which generally we ignore. But like if you, as a practice, if you look at it, there you would get to know that there are some nested interactions. Another way is to run some kind of automated accessibility check to get a report of such issues, because this is something which can be automatically figured out by tooling, unlike a lot of other accessibility things. So we can just run some automated checks to get a report and fix these. Now, the major problem comes when it is required as part of the design, right? So if designers can create a simplified markup, sure. If they cannot, then we have some options. One is we can use absolute positioning to position in the elements in a nested way visually, but in the markup they would still not be nested. Or the other way is to make sure that the functionality for keyboard and screen reader users is simple enough and exposed correctly, and we enhance the functionality for the visual users, because the designs are mostly catering to the visual users whenever they are nested, right? So like we will quickly look at some examples, and we'll quickly look at some of the solutions that could have solved this. So here you can see a card which is clickable as a whole, right? It takes you to a particular page if you click on the card as a whole. But then inside the card there is this three dot menu which is clickable once again, or which is interactive once again. So how do we build this behavior, right now? If you think about it from scratch, you'll probably end up creating a card component which will have a menu component as a child, right? Which means the card itself is interactive, and there is a nested menu component which again is interactive, which is not the correct pattern, right? So in here there are like some quick options. One is, since this menu visually also appears towards the end of the card, we can actually create it as a sibling of the card, right? So we can have a container which has this border. We can have a left side of the card which has this image, the text, these stats and everything, and then there is a right side of the card which has this three dot menu. The left hand side is individually clickable, the right hand side is individually clickable, which means that on the right hand side, if you click on anywhere apart from the three dot menu, that card wouldn't be clicked, right? But on the left hand side, wherever you click, the card would be clicked, right? So this will solve our nested interactivity problem and keep the behavior mostly same as what the designer expected, and like we wouldn't have any accessibility problems. Obviously this is like not a trivial thing to solve even in this case, because you need to change the markup a lot just to solve this smaller problem. But then like, yeah, since you have to solve this problem for screen readers and for other assistive tech, this is one way you can do things. Another one where we like interpret the design incorrectly, in those cases how do we solve it? So if you look at this design where there is a card and there is something which looks like a button which says got it, right? But the designer wants the whole card to be clickable, right? Not just the got it. They have placed the got it button so that the user gets to know that there is a CTA or this card is a call to action. But then since it is on mobile device, they wouldn't want to restrict the user interaction to just the got it, but the whole card. Anywhere on the card, if the user clicks, they should actually activate the functionality that is required. So in this case, as developers, what we would do is we'll already have a button component which exists as part of our component library or our reusable component. We'll have a card component. Again, we'll create a card component and put a button component inside it. Now the problem is the card is separately interactive, the button is separately interactive, although the button does not need to be interactive, right? Because we know the got it thing does not need to be separately clickable. Anywhere on the card, if the user clicks, they are going to activate the functionality. So in this case, the proper solution is to not use the button element, but just use a div which looks like this button and does not have any interactivity, right? Because we don't need any interactivity on this part, right? So as developers, if we are using a component based framework, by default we'll tend to use the button. But then if we are slightly more aware, we'll get to know that this can actually be just made using a div with these classes, because it does not have to be interactive. It looks like a button, but semantically it is not a button. So in that case, this will actually solve our problem. Another quick thing which can solve some of these problems is absolute positioning. So if you have seen Zoom, I think this screenshot is from Zoom, where there is this stop video button, where if you click on the button it will stop your video, but then there is also a menu on the right hand side where if you click you will see options related to your video. Now, again, in the UI, this looks like that the menu is actually nested inside the stop video button. But then, a good or easy way to solve these kind of things is they both of them can be siblings in the markup, and the menu can be absolutely positioned on top of the stop video button, right? So to the visual user, it still looks like it is something which is nested inside the button, but in the markup they are two separate things and they are just positioned in a way that they look nested. So markup wise we don't have any nested interactive elements, which means then the keyboard user or the screen reader tries to focus through it, they will first focus on stop video and then they move focus to the settings or the options menu. Now this one is like uh, slightly more advanced, where we actually need to make sure that we create the functionality, basic functionality for all, and then enhance it just for the screen reader users, right? So there is a like better example of this here. In this card you can see like these examples are obviously from some of our applications. So this is a small case card where the whole card is clickable. It will take you to the small case details page. There is a start investing button which again is clickable. There is a cross button which can also dismiss this card, right? So there are now three sections to this card, and the expectation is that if I click on these stats where it says 12.62%, it should actually like activate the whole card click, because the only things which do not activate the whole card click is clicking on start investing now or clicking on the cross button, right? So if you were like if you had to only solve it for the visual user, what you could have done is you could have created it in a nested way, and on click of this button you could have just either stop propagation or just made sure that you figure out when this element is clicked the parent handler should not be clicked or should not be triggered. Same for this button, but that just like that does not really solve the problem for keyboard users as well as screen reader users, right? Because the screen reader, when they come to this component in the current screen reader setup, I think any of the screen reader would not actually tell them that there is a nested element here. And even if it tells them, it is not something that they can really understand, because when the focus in on the whole card, what would the screen reader read? Should it just read all weather investing, high volatility, build recession proof well, blah blah blah, and or should it also read all weather investing, blah blah blah, and start investing now, Kager, min amount, or should it also read the close button or not, right? So that is not something that screen readers can do right now. They do not have an algorithm for figuring out what to do with nested interactive elements in terms of announcements and in terms of focus also. Like some screen readers would actually just skip focus on the internal elements. Like you, when you're using a screen reader, if you press the next button or the tab button or whatever button you use for focusing in your screen reader setup, you will see that they actually skip the start investing now and the cross button altogether and go to the next one. Right? To solve this, now all the things that we have seen till now, absolute positioning can work, but then like it will make the markup uh, very much ad hoc in a way, because now the absolute positioning needs to be for this button as well as this button, which is like now you'll have to mostly talk about how when the card gets smaller, how do you still position these elements when the card gets bigger on or like in other responsive kind of setups, where how do you position these elements. So the like to get rid of that generally, we would try to solve this in a way where we expose the same functionality for all the users, mouse users, keyboard users, screen reader users, and then we enhance the functionality just for the mouse user, which means that like for example the keyboard user does not need a focus on the whole card, right? For clicking the card, they can actually just have a keyboard focus on this title, and they can just like press enter to activate this, right? They do not really need to have focus on the whole card, right? So for a keyboard user, if you just assume that there are three elements which are focusable, and there is no nested interaction, which is like one element is this title, one element is this button, one element is this cross button. Now all of these are siblings. There is no problem for keyboard user if we just had to create this for keyboard users. But since we have to create it for mouse users in a certain way, so we like the markup is still nested in some way. So we'll see how to solve that. Again, for screen reader users, we have already discussed it, right? So in this case, what should we do? I'll just quickly walk through a example, right? So what we would do is for the keyboard users, we'll still like for all the users by default, we'll make this a link, make this a button, and make this a button, and the container does not have any role. Like it is not a div. It is not a button. It is not a link, right? It does not have any interactive roles by default. So all these three elements, they are now siblings. We don't have a problem with nested interactions. But now for mouse users, we can just add a extra on click on the container div without any role, right? Only for the mouse user. So which means that when the mouse user clicks on anything apart from all these three things which are siblings, which is not a problem, then we'll just like propagate that event to the parent div, and the parent div will just like do whatever clicking on this all weather investing would have done, which means it will just follow the link. And for the mouse user, the experience still remains the same, that they can click on anywhere on the card apart from these two places to actually uh, trigger the link. For the keyboard users, it remains a good experience that they have three tab stops which are siblings. They don't have a problem. For the screen reader users also, they have three tab stops because there is no nested interactive element. So for the screen reader user, how it would announce is the first focus will be on all weather investing, which will say all weather investing button, click to activate, or like press enter to activate. Then the next focus would be on start investing now, again would be announced as button, like press space to activate. Then the next focus would be on cross again. So the problem with screen reader users where they did not understand what to announce, and in some cases they would not even announce the nested element, that gets solved by this. Now, like one major question here is, we are still adding a on click to the container div, right? Does it not make it a interactive element? So if you have used ESLint accessibility rules, they will complain that you are using a on click on a div without adding any keyboard functionality or without adding a role, right? Which is true for 90% of the cases, but in this particular case, we do not want this element to be exposed as an interactive element to either the keyboard or the screen reader. We only want to make sure that this div just has a on click for the mouse users, which is why we are not going to add any role here, which is why we are not going to add any keyboard functionality here, and which is how we are not going to violate the 4.1.2 thing which we saw, where if there is an interactive element that is supposed to behave the same for screen reader users and mouse users, it should be exposed in through a interactive role. So this click on the outside card, this does not need to be exposed to the screen reader user, right? Because whatever the screen reader user needs to do to activate this click is by just going to this all weather investing text, and they can just like trigger whatever mouse users can trigger by clicking anywhere else. So we are maintaining the same functionality for keyboard users, screen reader users, and mouse users, and we are enhancing the UI or the visual functionality for the mouse users by making sure that we don't violate any of the accessibility principles or any of the spec that we have. So there is no nested elements now. There is no nested HTML. There is no nested role. There is no interactive elements which are nested. But again, this again is not a trivial solution, and it requires a different solution for each case, right? So in this case, the card look like this, but then in your case, there can be some other different nested interaction for which you would need to figure out how to exactly have a solution for your specific use case. Like this is a more like something which solved this particular use case, but then it may or may not solve your use case. But the thought process remains the same. Make sure that you expose the same functionality for screen reader, keyboard, and mouse users in some way, and then enhance it for the particular visual user if it is required, right? Because generally the designs would be created keeping in mind the visual user. So any enhancement that needs to be done would only be for visual users. So then in those cases, just have this thought process that you can enhance the functionality for the visual user. Cool. I think this is mostly it. This was the most complex nested interaction that I've seen in like the designs that I worked with till now. Obviously, the Twitter ones are slightly more complex, but then they also follow something similar in most cases. Uh, so in this case, another thing that we could have done is to just make sure that the designs are simplified and that there is no outside click required on the card, right? Instead of that, we just have three elements. But then that might have been too limiting for the designer, so we generally don't do that. Cool. I think this is the end of my presentation for nested interactive elements. There are a lot of references which I think are mentioned in the speaker notes in the slide. So people like Hayden Pickering, Adrian Rosalie, and Steve Faulkner, and all of these people are actually quite active with defining how to create nested interactive elements. You can follow them on Twitter. You can look at their blogs. They do have some more examples of how to create nested elements without compromising on accessibility. So if you are interested, you can go there. Yeah, again, apart from this, I work at Small Case and we are hiring right now. In case any of you are interested, please feel free to reach out to me. These are my social handles. All of them are Gaurav5430. Should be easier to find. Cool. That is